Our next panel is about to kick off. The first speaker, again, it's a cliche that he needs no introduction, but people have heard his name so many times this morning already that it can be relatively familiar. Rick Knowles is joining us from the University of Guelph, and he is a scholar, editor, director, and dramaturg. His work as a scholar and practitioner focuses on intercultural dramaturgies, especially in Toronto and Canada, on the semiotics of drama and theatre, and looking at his current research creation project with Monique Mojica, Leanne Howe, Jill Carter, Erica Isserhoff, and Candice Burnett, focuses on Indigenous knowledge and contemporary performance. And he'll be speaking today on new modernist mediations and the intercultural theatre of modern times stage company.
Thank you, and thank you, Tanya. And also, thanks to our hosts, Charlotte and Jason. I don't know if Jason's right in front of me, for holding this wonderful event and for inviting me to come and participate. It's a real honor to be included among the list of speakers, which is astonishing, and it's great to be here. So, I'll start right in, as others have. In theater, as in the world, intercultural encounters often require mediation. Patrice Pavis's familiar model of theatrical interculturalism, which presumes a one-way flow between source and target cultures, the former usually Eastern and othered, the latter Western, positions cultural mediation at the narrow point of a process shaped like an hourglass. This is where cultural texts are distilled to their presumed essences and subsequently expanded using the decoding semioses of the target culture, kind of like adding water to concentrated orange juice. The result is a watered-down version of the original that only benefits the Western producers and does violence to the source cultures, while also assuming both cultures to be culturally homogeneous. If theater that negotiates across cultures is to realize its transformative potential, it is crucial that more balanced ways of mediating be found. It may seem odd to consider modernism, a movement not friendly to the world's othered peoples, as a more balancing, mediating element. But perhaps that's one of its unfinished projects. And as new modernist studies suggest, modernisms have not been the same the whole world over. I argue here that the work of Sohail Parsa at Toronto's Modern Times Stage Company constitutes an exploration of multiply culturally inflected modernist forms as mediating elements that can facilitate negotiation across multiple global modernities. The Islamic Revolution in Iran, from which Parsa fled in 1982, can be understood in part as a response to and retreat from a secular westernizing modernization of the country that had taken place under the Shah of Iran, the country's last monarch. Within the newly minted Islamic Republic led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, it resulted in, among other things, the stifling of modernism in the arts, and part of that stifling was the voluntary or involuntary exile of many of its artists, including the future director of Toronto's Modern Times. Parsa had been in his final year of theater school at the University of Tehran in 1979, when he was expelled and forbidden to work because he didn't support the revolution. He fled, making his way to Canada by way of Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and India, arriving in Toronto in 1984, and later enrolling in the theater department at York University. My pages are sticking together. Upon his graduation in 1989, he co-founded Modern Times with fellow graduates Gregory Danakas, George Mirabelli, and Irish-Canadian Peter Farbridge. Parsa and Farbridge have remained artistic director and artistic associate from the beginning. Modern Times' mandate, deeply colored by Parsa's experience in Iran, has consistently involved a modernist vision that includes internationalism, inclusive humanism, and formal experimentation. Artistically and organizationally, Modern Times is committed to being a mutually respectful, culturally inclusive collaboration dedicated to humanist principles, producing provocative, emotional, and visceral productions that embrace a global view and transcend narrow ideologies and cultural expectations, searching for new and original forms of creation and expression, and exploring and taking inspiration from the uniqueness, commonality, and differences of the human experience. As a mission statement, this differs little from the intercultural projects of artists such as Brooke, Grotowski, and Barba, except crucially for its focus on uniqueness and difference. But there's no critique here of the appropriative practices of universalist humanism or Western modernism. Indeed, Parsa would be delighted to be positioned within the tradition of the great European modernists whose work he admires. In practice, however, Modern Times probes the intersection of Middle Eastern with Western forms in a much more even-handed way than that of Parsa's Western models. And its approach might best be described as new modernist, taking into account the different moments and ways at which modernity arrived in different parts of the world. The company has produced Shakespearean tragedies, high modernist European classics, modern Iranian plays, and new work from Canada's least theatrically represented communities. It's also been involved in a wide range of local and transnational collaborations. But centrally, Modern Times is a key link in the network of actors, or actants, within the intercultural performance ecology of the City of Toronto. They've co-produced and shared personnel with many companies in that network, and they participate through broadly intercultural casting and programming in the larger project of challenging the hegemony of whiteness on the city's stages. But Modern Times defines itself less according to identity politics than by a humanism that, at least on the surface, aligns itself with the expansive part of the project of new modernist studies. Calling what they do culturally unspecific theater, they affirm their belief that, as human beings, we can all simultaneously represent several different or plural identities. We oppose the presumption that people can be uniquely categorized based solely on their religion or culture, and seek to demonstrate the multiplicity of the human spirit in our work. Unlike other members of Toronto's intercultural performance ecology, Modern Times employs mixed casts of actors from the dominant culture and a wide variety of marginalized cultural and linguistic communities. The company practices then what Erika Fischer-Lichte calls the interweaving of performance cultures, and it shares with her a utopian belief in the transformative power of performance. Modern Times is perhaps a surprising name for a company whose popular reputation is based on staged adaptations of ancient Persian fables, inaccurately based on that, but that's their popular reputation. But the name is appropriate. Central to the company's importance is its contribution to the rethinking of modernism itself. Indeed, Modern Times can be understood to be working, in its modest way, towards the completion of what Jürgen Habermas called the unfinished project of modernity. According to Habermas, modernity held, quote, the extravagant expectation that the arts and sciences would not merely promote the control of the forces of nature, but also the understanding of self and world, moral progress, justice in social institutions, and even human happiness. Habermas is, however, skeptical about the project's potential success, citing, and rightfully skeptical, citing three conservatisms: anti-modernism, pre-modernism, and postmodernism, that work against it. In spite of Parsa's own experience with anti-modernism in Iran and his rejection of postmodern instabilities, Modern Times is more optimistic and, circumventing Habermas's gender blindness and his Eurocentric defense of enlightenment, explicitly extends this utopian expectation to all the world's peoples. The company's central project, I suggest, is the relocation and reclamation of modernist aesthetic practices from the appropriative forms of interculturalism. At its best, Modern Times explores the different kinds of difference that surface when power rests with those Western modernism has typically othered. It's unique among Toronto's intercultural companies in that it's grounded in three intersecting interests: the work of Western theatrical modernists, modern Iranian work, and Sufism. This paper will explore each of these as mediating factors in the company's interculturalism, drawing on and contributing to new modernist studies' expansive understanding of modernisms as illuminated by the purposeful blending of East and West. So the first section. Sohail Parsa studied at the University of Tehran at a key moment in Iran's history, at which the country was opening itself to Western influences in all spheres. Indeed, the Schwarze Arts Festival, held in the cities of Shiraz and Persepolis between 1967 and 77, began as a showcase under the patronage of the Shah's wife, Empress Faradiba, with the purpose of presenting contemporary Western art and demonstrating the country's openness to innovation. It attracted a pantheon of Western modernists, including Peter Brook, Joseph Chaikin, Jerzy Grotowski, Thaddeus Cantor, and Robert Wilson, whose influence on Iranian directors, according to Zara Hushmand, was huge. Quote, that their influence remains powerful after a generation and a revolution, she argues, speaks not only to the continuity of this lineage among Iranian theater artists, but also perhaps to a special cultural fit, a familiarity with the ritual roots of theater. Parsa was not immune to this influence. He attended the Schwarze Festival in 1971, where he saw Brooks Orgast in the ruins of Persepolis, and at theater school he viewed films of the festival's seminars and conferences. His working practices today remain very much in line with those articulated by Grotowski and Brook in their writings. He describes his work as, quote, creating a new ritual on the stage, and his process is consistently to simplify, strip away excess detail, and create the kinds of striking and self-contained images that are so central to high modernist formalism. Like his models, he searches for essences. Grotowski, Brook, and others have been criticized for being appropriative. Parsa practices a more inclusive and reappropriative modernism, as exquisitely crafted as the best of his models, but informed from inside by the performance forms of the Middle East and filtered through his lived experience. Parsa is very much aware of the modernist effacement and Orientalist exploitation of difference, even as he embraces the austerity of high modernist imagism. And indeed, it is the minimalist modernists with whom he's most frequently associated. Myra Friedlander compares the quote, psychophysical performance style of The Eighth Journey of Sinbad, 1992, to that of Grotowski. John Kaplan summons Beckett, Genet, and Kafka in describing Stories from the Reigns of Love and Death in 2003, while Kamal al-Sulaili adds Kafka and Pinter to the list. And Kaplan finds the central character in Guillermo Verdecchia's Bloom, quote, ensconced like a figure in a Beckett play. Like Brook, Parsa has staged versions of Shakespeare that are crisp, physical, and stripped of mannerist fussiness. And like Brooks, his work is infused with Eastern influences. Unlike for Brook, however, those influences are part of Parsa's lived experience, informing his vision and his belief system, as well as his style. The company's most widely known production of Shakespeare is their Macbeth, which opened in 1995 and toured in 1997, 2003, and 2005. Excuse me. Macbeth was deeply indebted to the traditional Persian Tazia Khani in ways that complicate too simple an understanding of Parsa's indebtedness to a Western modernist tradition. The Tazia is, quote, a treasure house of minimalist, expressionist theatrical technique, and Parsa's production was described by many as minimalist in the extreme. But the Tazia is not just about style, or even about content entirely appropriate to Macbeth. It portrays the historical beginnings of the Shiite faith, deals with martyrdom, doomed battle against impossible odds, slaughter of innocents, works for Macbeth. Quote, the most critical element of the performance that makes Tazia in its native environment such an emotionally overwhelming experience, Hushmand argues, is the people's own role as participants in an event not just reenacted, but relived in a catharsis of common mourning. In many ways, it was this emotionally participatory element that the modern times Macbeth evoked, notably in its performances in Tehran, where, as one audience member told the company, Macbeth is our life. According to Farbridge, who played an impassioned Macbeth, where am I? I seem to have lost. According to Farbridge, who played an impassioned Macbeth, one performance amidst a packed crowd in Tehran provided the most visceral audience stage experience of his life. I haven't imitated the Tazia Khani, Parsi said of the production, but I've used the form as a springboard. What he created was a sparse, austere ritual in the round. That's the Tehran production. Okay, that's Farbridge. A sparse, austere ritual in the round, with 9 barefoot actors playing 28 roles bearing flashlights for swords, scarves and sashes for costumes, elasticized headscarves and hand socks, and a single prop, a bowl for wine. What set there was simple and symbolic. Farbridge's Macbeth, I'll catch up. I'll let you know when I'm caught up. Was, in the words of one reviewer, quote, a bewildered victim of alien forces, a blood-soaked Faustian creation who sold his soul to Satan. Stavrola Logothetis, a Greek-Canadian actor, Lady Macbeth was described as, quote, a hyperactive sexual machine, a cat on the hot roof of Dunsinane. Although it didn't mention the Tazia, the show's program explained its rationale as, quote, a desire to put a Western classical play into an Eastern theatrical context, and evoked a world of the invisible where gods, witches, spirits, and demons live. This world, it explained, is not part of the day-to-day cultural experience of Western directors. However, for Sohail Parsa, these ideals are very much the threads that course through his own creative life, forming part of the framework of his culture. One critic evoked Brooke in citing the empty space purity of the staging, but it was clear that this was a show whose modernism was ultimately of a different source and orders than that of Brooke. That's obviously not. Parsa's theater training in Tehran exposed him not only to the work of Western modernist directors, but also to playwrights of the European avant-garde, whose work influenced him at a fundamental level. When he stages the modernist classics to which his work is so frequently compared, however, Parsa does so with difference as well as deference. Modern Times turned to Genet for its second production, The Balcony, in 1990. It's performed Ionesco twice, The Chairs in 2001, and The Lesson in 2012, produced a notable Waiting for Godot in 2008, and has just completed the inaugural run of Blood Wedding. But for me, the most telling of Parsa's and Modern Times reconsiderations of Western high modernism was the 2006 production of Argentinian-Canadian Guillermo Verdecchia's Bloom, originally planned as an adaptation of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, but because of permission problems with the Eliot estate, was presented as having been inspired by Eliot's modernist epic. And indeed, the play bears only occasional resemblance to the poem that inspired it. There is a range of quotations, citations, and distortions of The Wasteland and other poetry by Eliot, along with many other works ranging from Buddha's Fire Sermon and Dante's Inferno through Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales to Hamlet, Lear, Yeats, Beckett, Richard Dawkins, and reports by pilots out of Basra in the 1991 Gulf War. But the form of the show, a pastiche of citations and fragments from high and popular culture, paid tribute to Eliot's method. The basic situation was drawn from The Wasteland's companion poem, Gerontion, an old man and a boy in a dry month in Rat's Alley, reading, talking, singing off-color turns, and waiting for rain, while dogs bark, rats scuttle, jets roar overhead, and a crowd flows over London Bridge. There's quite a locative, quote, mixing memory and desire, as Eliot puts it, mostly Gerontion trying not to remember his time as a pilot and his relationship with the long-dead Marie, while the boy is, quote, stirring up everything, desiring more. But more, Gerontion tells him, is what brought us to this pass. Most reviewers found, in the presence of the boy, seeds of redemption. And Verdecchia himself admits, quote, there's hopefulness that something beautiful may emerge, something about the dogged persistence that keeps us struggling on, even if no hope seems possible. It's a distinctly modernist attitude, particularly when the struggling and the something beautiful takes the form of such artful, fragile, and inscrutable works as Bloom itself. Quote, I find something both pathetic and beautiful in continuing, despite all evidence that says forget it, Verdecchia says. Ultimately, the show cried out against forgetting. That's not the story, asserts the boy, is it? Bloom is unique, but perhaps also representative of much of Modern Times' work, and that it's most interesting for its intercultural appropriations of modernism itself, its skirting of the modernist capitalist alignment over ownership, the Eliot estate, its representing with a difference the high modernist appetite for the consumption of feminized other cultures, and its faith in the transformative power of performance. Thus the play's unnamed boy is spirited into the world of the aged, vision-impaired, and war-damaged European Gerontian to bring renewal, as primitive Eastern art was used by modernists to renew European decadence. And crucially, the role was played by the cross-cast Indo-Canadian Anita Majumdar. Ultimately, Bloom productively misrepresented Eliot's work as one among the fragments that an unsettled we shore against our ruins in the savage post-apocalyptic world in which it was set. Section 2. Prominent as the Western high modernists are in the modern times repertoire, they don't show up as often as the modern Iranian playwrights G.H. Saidi, Mohammad Rahmanian, Abbas Nalbandian, and Bahram Bazai. Bringing these into the modernist canon is some of the most important work modern times performs. But this modernism arose not simply out of encounters with European models. It combines an artistic response to modernity as it manifests in Iran with a deep engagement with Persian traditions. Indeed, Hushman claims a special affinity for modernist forms among Iranian playwrights, who, quote, weave together three strands of the political, the avant-garde, and the traditional, and to do so with the poetic sensibility that lies at the heart of Iranian cultural expression. Saidi, Nalbandian, and Rahmanian have contributed at least as much as Beckett, Ionesco, and Genet to modern times, but Bazai has been the company's most frequently produced playwright. Indeed, their first production was of The Conquest in 1989, an adaptation of a Bazai screenplay, and they've gone on to do 4 more. Best known as a member of a leading Iranian literary family and a prominent filmmaker, Bazai has written over 50 plays in which he draws directly on the work of Pirandello, Beckett, and Ionesco, but forges his own uniquely Iranian oeuvre. In the late 1950s and early 60s, Bazai did extensive research on pre-Islamic Persian culture. He subsequently studied traditional Iranian theater, arts, and painting, and he has had a dominant influence in the development of a non-Western identity for modern Iranian theater and film. Parsa's directorial style was firmly in place by the time he directed modern times' 4th Bazai play, The Death of Yazgird, in 1994, translated by Parsa and Farbridge as The Death of the King. Set in 642 CE, the play concerns the death of Yazgird III at the time of the Muslim invasion that effectively ended the Persian Empire. But it's not a history play. Bazai turns the story into a bleak, meta-theatrical fantasia about a family who may or may not have killed the man who may or may not have been the king. Much is made of the fact that no one can tell the difference between a destitute miller and a king. But it doesn't really matter, because the wolf, the first of centuries of invaders and occupiers, is already at the gate. As the priest prophesies, quote, when the millennium ends, the time of the wolf will begin, and divas will dance on the corpses of angels. The show represents modern times' fully developed minimalist style that blends striking visual imagery to tell ancient fables with contemporary applications in response to a complex and specifically Iranian-Canadian modernity. But Bazai's Orash, first staged by Modern Times in 1998, is the style's best exemplar. And it's not incidental that the company has since produced it in various of the world's most troubled contact zones. The program for the 2010 remount says, quote, in this piece we see the heart of modern times aesthetic. It is a true collaboration between Persian myth and our local artists' influence and interpretation. The myth on which it's based is simple. The story of a lowly stableman for the defeated Persian army who is forced to determine his country's borders by firing an arrow from the top of Mount Elborz. The arrow never lands. Orash disappears. And the fate of his people with classic modernist ambiguity remains unclear. Reviewers heard, quote, strong statements on a raft of issues, from the horrors of war and the greed of leaders to the plight of ordinary soldiers who are pawns in a vicious chess match between armies, to a plea for universal peace and a borderless world. The play is performed by 4 actors in the modern times stagings, indicated in the script only by letters, together narrating and performing a cast of thousands using the simplest of devices. The roles assigned to each actor have varied, sometimes making thematic associations across characters, sometimes working across gender roles, as in the 2010 remount when Michelle Latimer played Arash. In every case, it's employed modern times expressive physicality, combined with scenes of dialogue, and with a kind of choric narration, with all the actors doubling as narrators, producing simple, poetic, and yet curiously theatrical moments. Drums again, trumpets again. A falcon soars through the sky like a javelin, and the people cry out. The people of this land with their loudest cry say, "Yes, Arash, go to the enemy, and tell them you will fire the arrow, and wherever your arrow lands will be our land, wherever your arrow lands." At one point, 3 actors play Arash simultaneously, physicalizing his internal debate and staging archetypally modernist self-alienation. At another, that debate and alienation are voiced in a monologue, wrenching between first and third person. Who is Arash? A curved back that has been loaded and loaded? I am Arash, a man at once devout and pious. But now there are scorpions in my head. Now a wicked man called Arash, has stained me with disgrace. He is Arash, standing on the peak of a mountain, and his heart is my arrow's aim. I am Arash, the one who at sunrise was ignorant, and now at sunset knows something about the world. And he, Arash, screams, "I wish I didn't know." The actor's work was supported by clear and simple staging and powerful evocative sound and lighting, which feature as independent actants in most of the company's shows. And like the acting, none of this was naturalistic. The lighting, for example, employing primary colors, strobe effects, and even the flickering of onstage glow tape as stars. Different colored flags were used for the different armies, and the costumes consisted of plain pants and tunics with convertible sleeves on the forearms, which, switching from red to yellow, indicated their roles as enemies or Persians. The key was minimalist simplicity. As the actors reported, Sohail constantly pares down elements of a production and everything from props to movement to their essence. Third section, Sufism. This search for essences derives not only from Western modernist and ancient Persian sources, but also from a fascination with a transcendent, transnational brand of Sufism, originally a mystical dimension of Islam that shares with Buddhist, Taoist, Hindu, Kabbalah, and Christian mystic traditions that shares elements with them. In modern times understanding, the central goal of Sufism is, quote, to attain unity, truth, and a purer, more fundamental state of existence. Crucially, the company is interested in the artistic form of Sufi practices and rituals, including the dhikr, a devotional act of repetition that influences the music, dance, and rhythm patterns of the Sufi arts, as it influences those of modern times. Those arts include not only the company's characteristic rhythmic movements, but its reliance on Sufi poetry, notably the poems of Rumi and his meditations on Tawhid, the doctrine of oneness that transcends borders. In many of the company's productions, this is consciously represented by circles. Sufism has been a part of modern times from the outset, but the company's most extensive engagement with it, and one of their most highly regarded productions, was Farbridge and Parse's own play, Halaj. Loosely based on the life of 9th to 10th century Sufi mystic Mansur al-Halaj, the play is set in Halaj's prison cell in Baghdad on the eve of his torture and execution. Halaj was a legendary Sufi poet and philosopher who ran afoul of the authorities because of his teachings, his promotion of charity and spirituality over formal religious practice, compassion over judgment or violence, and his encouragement of Muslims to forego the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of all able-bodied Muslims, and spend the money they save on clothes for the poor, on liberating a slave, on feeding an old and hungry man. The action of the play focuses on efforts by the authorities and Halaj's friends and family to convince him to recant his heretical views. Throughout, he studies the philosophers, atheists, Christians, Jews, Neo-Hellenists, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Hindus, and Buddhists, unquote, en route to his dangerously leveling revelation, I am the truth, that God is in himself, and by implication, in everyone. Halaj finally welcomes his death, which is presented less as the cathartic purging of the heroic individual of Western tragedy than as the annihilation of the self in an ecstatic union with God and the universe. The production was notable in rehearsal for its relentless search for truth and essences, not unlike that of the show's subject. Here, as elsewhere, Parsa pares away at script and presentation to achieve a simplicity of which Halaj himself might be proud. His democratic rehearsal hall, welcoming creative input from all, seems a far cry from the guru-like intensity of the modernist masters, or the authoritarianism of the play's own caliph. Halaj was notable too for its engagement with earth, bodies, and movement, asserting not only the embodied nature of theater's engagement with modernism that Penny Farfan has affirmed, but also a contemporary performative engagement with the Sufi arts. The show characteristically included choric movement in its representation of the classroom, of Halaj's Sufi master, of riots and revolution, of Halaj's travels, and of his torture and death. But it also included representations of dance and of Halaj's trance-like, repetitive devotional movements that recreate dhikr, movements that reviewers characteristically called ecstatic fits, which in their own orientalizing vision they found to be mesmerizing. Halaj's incorporation of Sufi art practices into its new modernist vision, however, doesn't replicate the Western modernist raiding and decontextualizing of the cultural forms of a primitive other. Rather, it engages in thematic, philosophical, and theological ways with living cultural arts and practices as they are embedded in the lives and belief systems that produced and continue to engage them. And it does so in a way that fossilizes neither the source materials, the cultures from which they emerge, nor the company's own work. As Parsa said recently of the company's 2014 show, Forgiveness, and in contradistinction to the hermetically sealed works of European high modernism, as they tightly contain modernist anxieties about the passage of time, it's not finished. None of our work is ever finished. Conclusion. Theater, as its messy materiality, vulgar theatricality, and formal impurity, has had a vexed relationship with the theorists, historians, border police, and manifesto writers of modernism. And until recently, it has until recently been largely ignored, even within the expansive global project of new modernist studies. Intercultural theater has had an even more vexed relationship with the modernist project. The interculturalism of modern times, however, is less troubled by a narrowly Western modernism than mediated through transnational modernist forms, specifically through a theatrical practice that responds to a newly complex and globally diasporic modernity that pays attention, as Farfan argues, quote, to modernism's local, material, corporeal, lexical, and interactive dimensions in performance. It's a theatrical modernism that responds directly to what Alice Moody, in an essay on Waiting for Godot in post-Katrina New Orleans, considers to be the localizing potential made available by the very ahistoricism of the modernist classic. When applied to the intersecting diasporas that constitute the city of Toronto, this potential is realized as, quote, a cross-border dialogue, a transnational process rather than a transnational identity, one that engages the Western modernist, ancient and contemporary Persian, Iranian, and local intercultural Torontonian in a vital conversation aimed at advancing, if not completing, modernity's fabled and utopian unfinished project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. A wonderful evocation of the company's ethos as well as their work. Next we're welcoming Lizzie Stewart, who is joining us from the University of St Andrews, where she's currently a teaching fellow, teaching the German language and German literature and theatre. Her work focuses on the Turkish-German scripts of post-migration, mimesis and mimetism in the plays of Emine Sevgi Özdemir and Feridun Zaimoglu and Gunter Senko. Apologies to Judy Coachman how to pronounce that, I'm pretty sure I still got it wrong. She examines theatre migration in contemporary Germany and focuses on productions of plays between 1986 and 2011. Her talk today is entitled The Future Market and the Current Reality, Zaimoglu and Senko's Black Virgins and Interculturalism in the German Context.
Okay, so obviously following Rick Knowles is particularly petrifying, so hopefully this is okay. And if not, it's a good opportunity to digest all of the amazing thoughts we've had so far this morning. In 2006, a controversial semi-documentary play about Muslim women became the first play by a Turkish-German playwright to be featured on the front cover of Germany's influential theatre magazine Theater Heute, or Theatre Today. The play was written by a playwriting duo, Feridun Zaimoglu, who's better known as a Turkish-German author and novelist, and his co-writer / assistant, Gunter Senkel. And it was directed in its premiere production by Neco Celik and titled Schwarze Jungfrauen, or Black Virgins in English. The dramatic text of this play, Black Virgins, is a radical collection of 10 semi-fictionalized monologues, each corresponding to a different female character, or neo-Muslima, so neo-Muslim, as Zaimoglu calls them. And the monologues were apparently the result of conversations conducted by Zaimoglu with Muslim women living in contemporary Germany. He then took these conversations and reworked them into his own artistic language. So he's very free with his sources. The resultant texts are very extreme in several senses, politically, linguistically, and also in explicit content concerning the women's sexuality. So in monologue 6 of the play, of the dramatic text, for example, we have the following quotation. So one of the Black Virgins of the play declaims, "I don't bandage myself up like a mummy. I am not, how do you say, abstinent. God forgive me, I have to say it. I still fuck because I know it doesn't damage my faith. I pray 5 times a day, I fast in Ramadan, and I'm a committed Muslim." So as the kind of headline that Theater Heute used to promote the play suggests, it was this combination of sex and Islam that made the play of particular interest to German audiences. And as Katrin Sieg, who's written extensively on this play in its premiere production, highlights, the emphasis in Black Virgins on Islam as a means of female emancipation and path to self-expression obviously stands in contrast to a discourse which was prevalent already in 2006, which presents Islam as inherently antithetical to supposedly European values such as women's rights, gay rights, etc. So for the premiere production, first-time theatrical director Neco Celik and his dramaturgical team created a playful montage of just a few of the original monologues. They occasionally merged characters together, and as Katrin Sieg has highlighted, they cut the text to highlight aspects of the monologues which addressed sexuality. So we have an even stronger focus on sexuality in the premiere production. This reworked text was presented in a very abstract mise-en-scène, where actresses in flesh-coloured bodysuits and bald caps appeared in blue lit boxes to deliver their sections of the monologues. So the distance between the women on whose voices the play was supposedly based and the bearers of those voices on stage was highlighted through this abstract mise-en-scène, or that was the intention at least. Apparently audience members waited outside of the first productions to kind of try and talk to the women, find out about their real lives as Muslim women. So even despite this abstract staging, the fact that the actresses were Turkish German seems to have overridden any kind of anti-representational element present there. So, as Frauke Matters has highlighted, the prevailing reception of the text as kind of authentic insights into the hearts and minds of female Muslims in Germany appears to be part of its attraction for audiences. And although it first appeared on the smallest stage of Berlin's Hebel am Ufer Theater complex, when it was commissioned for a very short run in the context of a minor experimental theatre festival. So this is where it started, on this tiny stage. You know, there were only going to be a couple of performances. Since then, the production has followed the festival's organiser, Shermin Langhoff, in her move up through Germany's theatrical institutions. So Shermin Langhoff is a really interesting figure. She's she was born in Turkey and married into the Langhoff dynasty in Germany, this theatrical dynasty there of directors, and worked in film and with Fatih Akin, if any of you know his filmic work. So she worked with him before moving into theatre herself. Anyway, so she commissioned the play back in 2006 as part of this festival, and then in 2010 the premiere production, so the same production, reopened in Langhoff's own new theatre, the Ballhaus Naunenstraße, which you can see a little picture of here. And this is a theatre which aimed, or still aims, to provide a platform both for what it calls post-migrant perspectives and for the work of artists with a background of migration within the theatrical establishment. So I think somebody was mentioning earlier, are there models that are kind of ground up? And I think the Ballhaus Naunenstraße, I would say, can be considered that. It has this thing called the Academy of Autodidacts that it's involved in. So since then, Langhoff has moved on to run the Gorki Theater in Berlin, and this production of Black Virgins can now be seen there on one of Berlin's most significant stages. So you can really see how it's moved from this tiny, tiny corner of the theatrical establishment right into the centre of Berlin's theatrical life there. In this process, this production of Black Virgins has assumed a kind of flagship status for post-migrant theatre. And this was illustrated by the fact that it was recently advertised on the Gorki's Facebook feed as Schwarze Jungfrauen, der Klassiker, Black Virgins, the classic play. So already it's got its canonical place there. Bless you. However, this is far from the only form in which Schwarze Jungfrauen, Black Virgins, has made its way into the German theatrical consciousness. So following the successful premiere, Black Virgins has appeared in at least 11 further professional productions in Germany alone, signalling an industry desire for post-migrant perspectives, which was previously absent from the theatrical sphere there. So my apologies to the wonderful digital humanities ladies. This is my little map that I made myself. The stars don't the different sizes are not indicative, that's just my bad use of paint. So I think we can really see how far digital humanities can take us in this kind of thing. Anyway, it gives a very rough idea, unpolished idea perhaps, of how the play has spread around Germany in these various productions. And of course the premiere production also toured a lot as well, so we would have had all of your thick lines too if we had that. Yes. So the majority of studies of the play so far have focused on the influential premiere, but here I want to explore this proliferation of subsequent productions. And in particular, I want to situate this proliferation against a broader background of a shift towards interculturalism in cultural policies within Germany. So while part of the play's popularity is to do with the post-9/11 fascination with Islam, a desire to see Muslims tell about themselves, I think it also indexes and has contributed to a broader shift at work in German theatre over the past 10 years or so. So if I first show you some images from the various productions of Black Virgins, which have followed the premiere, you'll see it's been performed in a wide variety of modes. So ranging from the earnest and very naturalistic to much more playful and post-dramatic aesthetics. And I think in the mise-en-scène of each, a different attitude to the text of Black Virgins and the claims it makes or doesn't make towards authenticity are being expressed. So if we have a look in particular, oh no, why is it doing that? At the first production to follow the premiere, a production by Christian Schwarze at the Westfälisches Landestheater, which is just a small kind of local theatre in the northwest of Germany. So Schwarze staged his production using 5 of the monologues from the original 10 monologue dramatic text, and each of the monologues were performed en bloc with only minor cuts. So this suggests quite an earnest desire on the part of the director to let the women, supposedly at the source of the play, have their say. And the use of naturalistic costume, well, what he considered naturalistic costume at least, so headscarves, etc., together with the delivery of the two actresses who took turns at kind of becoming each woman, aimed convincingly at psychological realism. And in the marketing, we have lots of kind of emotion-laden close-ups, etc., which I think emphasise that as well. So the very earnest relationship to the text and genre of Black Virgins that we see in Christian Schwarze's production contrasts very strongly with that of Anja Wedig at the Theater Junges, Bremen. So this is, German theatre, going for it, as it does. So I spoke to Anja Wedig as well as to Christian Schwarze, and she explained that although she actually did believe Zaimoglu in his claim that the monologues were based in real conversations, real experiences, and that was part of the impetus for her in producing the play, she also wanted to capture the ambiguity surrounding the degree of intervention which Zaimoglu took the liberty to take in her own portrayal of the monologues. So she kind of created this carnivalesque fairground where monologues took place at different stations, each under a different kind of sub-director. So Anja Wedig kind of choreographed the whole thing and then had different other directors bringing in their own views on things. So we have a real proliferation of authorship here. And elaborate, fantastical costumes were created in which the actors' faces, like the words originally spoken by the women interviewed by Zaimoglu, were partially obscured by fantastic creations. So, for example, a knitted vagina hood is one of the costumes, which is a reference to the fact that this is often considered in Germany kind of almost a vagina monologues for Muslim women. So I've highlighted these two productions here because one of the critiques that's been made of Black Virgins as a play is that it not only ventriloquizes the Muslim woman, so overwrites her voice with that of the male playwright, but also that in doing so it sells out the Muslim woman to a German audience which is desirous of authentic insights into an exoticized figure. So Ipeke Celik makes this argument very strongly, and she views the play as a cynical usage of Muslim women as marketable commodities, with which a minority author creates a niche for himself in the neoliberal market. So I think her intervention is important, but I also think it's important to stress that, well, as these productions show, the theatrical form always involves mediation. There is no direct truth that can be presented on stage just with no interruption, no mediation. And interestingly, here it's the more interventionist directing which highlights this best. The other slight problem I have with this reading is that it overlooks the significant role which Zaimoglu's play occupies in making it onto a state-funded stage in Germany at all. So as recently as 2004, Errol Boren, who's a Canadian scholar, was able to characterise the German theatrical landscape as a closed shop or private party, as far as Turkish German practitioners in particular were concerned. So although 1 in 5 people in Germany now have what is there called a background of migration, by which is meant a background of recent post-1945 migration, it was only in May 2011 that the Dramaturgische Gesellschaft, so German's dramaturgical society, felt the need to even ask itself, who is we? Wer ist wir? Who are we? And to take the theme of the intercultural society as the theme for its annual conference. So this is a very new concern or a new subject for discussion in Germany. I think in the UK context and in quite a lot of other contexts it sounds really kind of like rehashing old ground, but this is the start of this discussion really in Germany, is in the past 10 years. So, while I disagree with Ipek Celik's criticism of the play's form as dramatic text, I I do think that her concerns might be more productively addressed in an examination of the structural changes which have contributed to the sudden proliferation of productions of Black virgins, as well as of other semi-documentary theatre productions which focus on migration and post-migration in Germany. So just to give you a bit of an idea, examples of this genre include other plays by Zaimoglu and Senkel, so they've written several semi-documentary plays now. They keep getting commissioned for them because the first one was so successful. There've also been projects in Essen by Nur and David Kalis, in Hanover, and several projects at the Bauhaus now in Schwarze, the theatre I mentioned right at the beginning there as well. So it's the structural element of this proliferation which really brings me to interculturalism properly. So this sea change in what's coming onto the German stages appears to be closely related to the alteration of German citizenship law in 2000 and the subsequent adoption of an intercultural action plan by the cultural senates of areas such as North Rhine-Westphalia and Berlin, so areas characterized by high migration or high post-migrant populations. So Azadeh Sharifi, who's done lots of work on this area, she explains that since the 1990s, German cultural policy has followed the motto of Kultur für alle, so culture for all, a model in which public cultural funding can only be legitimised if, in addition to the funding of art, an active effort to involve the population in cultural and artistic life is also present. So this is kind of apparently what's at the basis of current cultural policy in Germany. Following the expansion of citizenship law in 2000 to include those born in Germany rather than just those of German heritage, what we have is the fact that the right of the citizen to culture, so das Bürgerrecht Kultur, is now not only applied to German citizens, and by that she means ethnically German citizens, but also to citizens with a background of migration. Interculturalism should be the basis and the point of departure of all activities, according to this kind of policy shift. And as Ona Nubrega, who's also worked in this area, explains, this kind of follows the debates about gender mainstreaming. So it's often called intercultural mainstreaming in Germany as well, which the first time I heard that, it's kind of, what? I don't know what either of those words mean, but they're using them in English, so it's quite confusing. Anyway, what I find particularly interesting is, to paraphrase some of Charlotte's work, what this shift towards interculturalism there both enables and demands, particularly in terms of the aesthetics of post-migrant theatre and those involved in its production. So I want to talk about this with relation to the multiple productions of Schwarze, of Black Virgins, but first I want to address the term interculturalism in a bit more detail. This is the bit I'm scared about doing in front of you all. So at the beginning of my PhD, kind of 4 or 5 years ago, I was very surprised to hear the term interculturalism raising its head with respect to theatre by Turkish German artists. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So firstly, the main body of scholarship on Turkish German cultural production which exists is on Turkish German literary production and film. And there, interculturalism is frequently associated with a sociological approach to this cultural production, which tends to characterize cultures as homogeneous closed constructs. And literary work by Turkish German authors, including Zaimoglu, who's, as I said, also a novelist, has long been considered under the umbrella of intercultural literature rather than German literature in German universities. So they're seen as separate literatures, really. And the historian Rita Chin has traced this development from the early 1980s onwards in her book, The Guest Worker Question, which is all in English and is really, really good. So if anyone's interested, that would be the one. So Rita Chin shows the way in which this term moves from the sphere of social work in Germany into the sphere of literary criticism. And following this, German intercultural literary studies have often focused on the social or pedagogical function of this writing. So of writing and reading literature by authors with a background in migration. This is a bit of an issue because obviously such kind of readings don't preclude historical concerns or analytical complexity. So I'm quoting Leslie A. Adelson there. However, they can kind of function to reduce literature from being of artistic merit to being purely of social merit and interest. So this is an approach which has been heavily criticised within particularly Anglo-American, German studies, as reducing the work in an ethnocentric manner to its value for cultural communication and functioning to anchor literature by authors of non-German ethnicity firmly in their otherness. So I have to confess that I was surprised to find that as the tide was turning away from interculturalism in literary studies, interculturalism appears to have re-emerged to haunt the Turkish-German artists as a key term in the theatrical context in the 2000s. And of course, as you all know, in a theatrical context, interculturalism has more generally been used to explore how the semiotics of a piece translates across boundaries. So, for example, Erika Fischer-Lichter, who works in the German context, tends to use interculturalism to analyse a play written in one cultural context and how it transfers to another radically different one, rather than plays produced within one locality. So for me, an intercultural approach to analysing theatre produced by playwrights of another ethnic origin within Germany seemed kind of inappropriate. And I would argue that an earlier focus on intercultural theatre there results in either a preference for analysing theatre companies invited to Germany from other countries over the products of resident Turkish-German theatre artists, or risks suggesting that the Turkish-German playwright is as culturally foreign to Germany as, for example, 19th century Russia may be to a modern Japanese audience, which is one of the Patrice Pavis, Erika Fischer-Lichter examples. Just as the play transforms significantly when moving from page to stage, however, interculturalism as a concept is in the process of morphing further, which is why we're here. And in the German context, Katrin Sieg has pointed out that the introduction of European Union funding for projects with specific remits intended to promote diversity on the stage has forced open the demographic structure of the institution, as she says, achieving what a century of feminist complaints and several decades of immigrant activism have not been able to accomplish. So it's not that people didn't want to make theatre before, it's just it was all going on kind of away from the centralised stages. So, building on this opportune turn of events, migration researcher and journalist Mark Terkessidis has provided a Deleuzian redefinition of interculture, which has been highly influential in Germany's theatrical sphere in recent years. So he takes the term interculture and redefines it as culture in emergence, as a structure in the process of transformation, as something which is not whole or not yet. And I actually wanted to talk loads and loads about Terkessidis today, but then I thought I'd just be basically translating everything he said. So. Anyway, so in contrast to the understanding of culture as something tied to the ethnicized or racialized identities of authors with a background in migration, which is frequently adopted in literary studies which use an intercultural framework, Terkessidis emphasizes culture as a product of organizations and institutions, rather than bound people via ethnicity. Furthermore, Terkessidis' conception of interculture creates a situation in which, rather than the migrant being the exception to the rule, so a category to be dealt with specially and separately, the migrant or post-migrant becomes the paradigm for the contemporary subject. So we are all in interculture. And I think what's interesting about this is his work positions Interkultur or intercultural as an alternative both to the programme of multiculturalism and the rhetoric of assimilation, which can be quite dominant in Germany. So I just want to take a few examples from the production history of Black Virgins to kind of talk about how this plays out in practice. So as I said, the Westfälisches Landestheater was the second theatre to stage Black Virgins after the extremely successful premiere back in 2006 at the Hau in Berlin. The director, Christian Schwarze, was familiar with the playwright Zaimoglu's work from having previously directed a dramatised version of one of Zaimoglu's literary texts back in 1999. He called this piece Almanya, and this piece not only began a working relationship between Zaimoglu and Schwarze, it was also very timely. It's from 2002 onwards. The state of North Rhine-Westphalia adopted this emphasis on intercultural work. So this change in cultural policy provided funding specifically for developing intercultural competencies within institutions in the area. As a touring theatre, the Westfälisches Landestheater already had close links to schools in the area, so it didn't have its own theatre building for a long time, it just toured around. And so following the success of Almanya, this first piece of work with Zaimoglu, Schwarze was in a good position to bid for funding for further projects under the umbrella of Interkultur. And when I interviewed him in 2011, Schwarze emphasised the advantage of having this extra money available in terms of making theatre relevant to contemporary life in the area and contemporary debates. So generally, because this theatre is a small theatre, they had to set their programme a year and a half in advance, and that led to a relatively apolitical set of productions. However, as a result of the funding from the Intercultural Action Plan, when Black Virgins came out in Berlin, Schwarze was able to mobilise the resources in his area to fund a version of that play very quickly. The success of that play in North Rhine-Westphalia in turn helped the theatre to consolidate its new role as an intercultural facilitator. And it really advertises itself as that now. So it offers training workshops on how to do interculturalism to other cultural institutions in the area. And I think the pedagogical emphasis we have here helps explain the very serious naturalistic aesthetic that we saw, that you can see here. So I'm going to skip a little bit because I think I'm coming towards the end. No? Yeah, skip a little bit. So while Black Virgins helped set a new direction for the Westfälisches Landestheater, the production of Black Virgins for the off-scene theatre group Junges Bremen, so this was our Vagina Monologues version, this functioned more to continue an established interest in post-migrant theatre on the part of this particular theatre group. So this interest dated back to the commission of a play by Zaimoglu Senkel in 2003, so this was actually one of their very first commissions. And according to the director, Anja Wedig, their interest in Zaimoglu's work stemmed from two impulses. So they're a young theatre group interested in contemporary themes and language, as well as the related theme of how the self deals with its environment. So for them, it wasn't a case of trying to do post-migrant theatre, it was just the play interested them. Furthermore, a lot of members of the group happened to be post-migrant. So for them, this was already a normal way of kind of dealing with a text. So in her chapter on post-migrant theatre in Berlin, Nina Peters has described the off-scene as being significantly ahead of state theatres in terms of its engagement and a level of comfort in producing post-migrant theatre. And that this is to a degree the case throughout Germany, is suggested by Wedig's attitude to her production. So while in 2008, Black Virgins was a striking novelty in the slower moving state-sponsored theatres, it was already quite like a normal type of play to put on for these off-scene theatres. So coming to the end, as migration scholar Mark Terkessidis has emphasised, to a degree the new enthusiasm for migration in theatre follows a neoliberal logic in which demographic change in Germany has led to the recognition of the post-migrant as an increasingly important consumer as well as citizen. However, it also offers an opportunity in which precisely the all-present question of migration could be connected with the renewal of the theatre industry. At the same time, this is again problematic because not only do we then have post-migrant lives and bodies providing raw material thematically for the reanimation of the German theatre, we also have a recognition of post-migrants as not just citizens, but above all as consumers in terms of audiences, needed by a model which one could say is in decline. So, in a case of life mirroring art, perhaps, in the dramatic text of Black Virgins, the Black Virgin of Monologue 5 identifies herself and her sisters as the future market and the current reality. So while scholars such as Ipeke Çelik have questioned the political legitimacy of Black Virgins, and I think it's right to do that questioning, I think it is important, and have positioned this play as one in which a male playwright creates or lays bare a confessing Muslim woman for the desiring gaze of a mainly German audience. At the same time, this knowing nod to the market within the very script of the play, I think also highlights the role which this kind of desiring gaze, however problematic, might have to play in a pragmatic politics of recognition for post-migrant artists who want their work to be seen. And I think this quote highlights the negotiations which intercultural funding opportunities mean that post-migrant playwrights in Germany have to kind of undertake.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating to have this wonderful sort of diachronic examination of one play in a particular culture and conversation with Rick Knowles, discussion of the evolution of a company. So we have, thanks to Lizzie's generosity, we have oodles of time for questions. So if you guys may want to join us. And we'll open it up.
I'll be right there.
Very pragmatic question. Lizzie, I was really interested by the fact that, so there's a dramatic text of these monologues that exist, but it seems like for each production that there is editing that is done of the overall dramatic text. So could you say a little bit more about why only part of it is performed and how the editing happens each time?
Yeah, so first of all, it's really long as it is, so it's 10 monologues, just one after another. And there are no stage directions, there's no framing of those monologues in any way. So I think the dramatic text actually demands this of the directors. You know, you get presented with this lump of text and you have to do something with it. You can't just stage 10 long monologues one after, it's just exhausting and boring, you know. And I think that's partly because of the way that in Germany directors tend to cut into a text anyway. So in a way you're in this situation, well, why bother writing a play as such? Why not just produce some text and see what happens with it? And I think it's also, and then also to do with the fact that Zaimoglu started as a prose writer, and then he was actually invited by various theatres around the early 2000s to produce plays, and the first plays he tried to do were actually more kind of, you know, you had stage directions, you had characters in dialogue with each other, but it's really these big kind of monologue pieces that seem to have been taken up more readily by the establishment now.
I've got a question for each of you about audience. Who's going to see Black Virgins? Who's going to see Modern Times, especially the second and the third type of performances they do?
You want to go first?
don't think there's a huge difference among the three different types that I schematized in terms of audiences for their shows. The theater, the audience that goes to the kinds of theaters that I'm working on in Toronto, which are these culturally specific, cross-cultural, intercultural, whatever they're called, mandates, is probably pretty much the same across the city. And it's a fairly dedicated theater-going audience. It's, in terms of cultural makeup, it's quite mixed. I'd say it's probably reflective of the Toronto mix, which is Toronto's population now is about 49% Caucasian and 50, 51, 52 maybe percent non-white, non-dominant. And that's probably the percentage of cultural context for these shows. Mixing a bit, they probably get, I would think that they probably get a slightly lower, a slightly higher Middle Eastern, Persian Iranian audience than most, which you would expect, whatever the show is. And that's more loyalty to Sohail Parsa himself than anything else, I think. The houses, well, Blood Wedding just closed, and the run was sold out, which is remarkable in Toronto. So they have a pretty loyal audience, and they just celebrated the 25th anniversary. I wouldn't argue that that audience has been there since the beginning. It's been very much working at developing that audience over 25 years.
So with Black Virgins, obviously the audience is different in each location. So for each production, there'll be a different audience. The premiere production, when it first came out, so this Beyond Belonging Festival was intended to attract the local post-migrant population into the How. That's part of the rationale for that festival being there, because the How is in Kreuzberg, or a couple of the, I think all of it, which is the big Turkish, where there is a big Turkish-German population. So this idea of the German Stadttheater, where you make theatre for the town that you're in, comes into play there. So, and increasingly what you have in Germany over the past couple of years as well is artistic directors taking on a new theatre, and part of their kind of mission statement will be that they're going to open it up to a broader audience, and that will be a post-migrant audience in a lot of cases. So initially, the aim was to get more kind of Turkish German and post-migrant people into the theatre. I think the opening night, it was something like, according to anecdotal evidence, 90% German or something. So I think basically the theatrical journalists in Berlin had heard about this play, and it was full of kind of like reviewers and things the first night. Then when it moves to the Bauhaus Naunenstraße, which is kind of a neighbourhood theatre, again you have quite a mixed audience there. So that I don't think that they are kind of noting their audience, if you see what I mean. What's that called?
Demographics?
Yeah, I don't think they're doing demographics. I don't think they're taking note of kind of things during booking or anything. But when you go to the Bauhaus, it tends to be a mixture of kind of like people like me who are like, oh, I've heard there's this amazing theatre going on here, let me go. And people from the neighbourhood. And I suppose the best way to tell it is when there's a joke in Turkish in one of the plays, you can hear like different bits of the audience laughing and other bits of silence. So it is a mixed audience there. With the Westfälisches Landestheater example, because it was a pedagogical, to a degree, a pedagogical engagement with the play, they toured it to loads of schools, and the schools there, you're mainly looking at a post-migrant audience. Mm-hmm. So there it really wasn't to do with trying to attract some kind of middle-class German, self-satisfied kind of thing. There it really was an attempt to engage with the audiences, and interestingly, of course, the audiences speak back. So then the theatre has to adjust its practices. So apparently I found a letter in their archives, which I don't know if I'll get to publish, probably not, where this woman had emailed in saying, with a complaint, basically she felt the content was inappropriate for Ramadan. So they'd accidentally put the play on during Ramadan and not really thought that that's maybe a culturally sensitive time of year. And she said she didn't have a problem with the way Islam was portrayed with it in general, but the degree of swearing and focus on sexuality wasn't appropriate for Ramadan. So then the theatre is suddenly having to rethink things it does. So we have always this interplay between, or this tension between it actually being a great, the thing you want it to be, and also being really problematic.
I have a similar question for both of you, but about funding. I'm wondering how these modern times and how these various productions are funded.
My turn?
Yeah, sorry.
The primary source of funding for modern times is the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. So the three arts councils are the majority of their funding. They do private fundraising and box office.
But on a project basis, or are they regularly funded?
It's a funny combination. Canada has a very strange funding system, or several very strange funding systems. They are on ongoing funding with the Canada Council at the moment, project by project with the Ontario Arts Council and the Toronto Arts Council. And then they have regular fundraising events within the Persian/Iranian community, more generally, donors from, corporate donors, also donors in kind, the usual kinds of stuff like any professional company.
In terms of Black Virgins, again, it varies from production to production. So the Bauhaus Naumenstraße, they are funded by the Cultural Senate in Berlin. And their funding kind of comes in big chunks, so it's kind of a couple of years at a time, and then they have to see if they'll get more. And I can't remember the details of that fund, but two other people have written about it a lot. So Una Nobrega, she looks at it a lot, and Catherine Seed also looks at that in quite a lot of detail. And then with the subsequent productions, it varies again. So Schwarze is definitely getting money from this intercultural fund that's there. I know that there's one production that happened in Frankfurt where it was funded by the German Islam Conference. So it does tend to be kind of intercultural funding rather than just kind of artistic funding. But I suppose the big difference is that previously there wasn't very much of that, and it does seem to be increasing significantly. And so Errol Boren is this scholar he did the first big piece of work on Turkish German theatre, which he did in 2004. So everything's changed hugely since then. But one of his main conclusions was basically like, we don't really have very much Turkish German theatre because of the funding situation. So there was, even when people were making theatre, they would get these tiny project-based bits of funding, and then it would be taken away. So he really relates it to the funding situation.
I should say, by the way, when they tour, when they go beyond Canada, different sources of funding apply, either from co-production, from hosts, or from the Canada Council Touring Office. So there's different, they piece together.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. In terms of audience, well, I've been a very avid audience goer at the Bauhaus Naumenstraße. And just on a very personal note, it was the only theatre where I really felt at home in Berlin.
Really?
Really felt at home. And this was during the tenure of Charmaine, when Charmaine was there. It was the liveliest theatre in town. And as Charmaine, who is an extraordinary person, she said, the reason it's lively is it's got the best bar in town and give the best parties in town. And she was right. So there was something very special about being, and I'm speaking now as somebody coming from another culture who spent time in Berlin, very awed by the German theatre, the Schaubühne, the Volksbühne, etc. But over 3 years, after 3 years, I really began to resent that theatre.
Oh, really?
Because it's so exclusionary. It is so
The
white.
Bauhaus.
Not the
Oh, no.
Bauhaus, I mean not the
Okay.
Bauhaus. Bauhaus was important precisely because it was the one place where it didn't matter really where you were from, but yet there were all kinds of people there. But this is a big problem. And I mean, the German history of interculturalism really has to be taken on very seriously. And it's a complex kind of history. I could say more, but maybe, it's enough for the moment. Not on camera. The other thing was funding. I think it's pitiful how much, there's so much funding available for some of the state theatres. I mean, there was the Schaubühne just came to Delhi for one show of Enemy of the People, the Ostmeyer brilliant production, of course. And it's an astronomical amount. Because although there may be 7 or 8 characters in that play, but there are 35 people in the technical crew. 35. So you're paying, fares going back and forth, Just on a personal note, I was offered a job in the Kampnagel in Hamburg many, many years ago. And of course very exciting and to be offered that job, but I didn't take the job and because I didn't think I could make a difference to that festival. But I'm bringing it up because I do have very specific figures that I can share because it's a long time ago, before the euro even came on the scene, so it was marks. So they had a budget for the main theatre throughout the year. They had a budget for their international festival throughout the year. So I was being asked to be the director of the international festival for 2 weeks, okay? It was 2.4 million marks. And the budget for the theatre was also 2.4 million marks. So that goes to show how much importance was being given to the festival. So I asked the director who had asked me to take the job, why don't you take it? She said, I'd love to take it, but they won't allow me to take it because, there might be a conflict of interest. If you have 2.4 million, then you can spend a little bit of that budget on the festival. And they said, no, festival, you have to spend all that money on the festival. So when I met these city guys who were kind of interviewing me, I said, how much do you pay for, at that time I used the word multicultural because there was 700,000 marks for everything.
Okay.
So that was, it's just very revealing
Yeah.
how much importance was being given to all of this, So this is just a supplement to, and now that Charmaine has left and joined Gorky, things are not looking too good at the Bauhaus. And from friends, Oliver Contney was a dramaturg, and he's written a lot on post-migrant, so he's a dear friend. It's project by project, the funding. It's not something that can be guaranteed, so it's a very precarious existence.
And what they did with the funding they had is amazing. So I think there's a quote from Sherman Langhoff where she says, it's like trying to, she has this really great quote about basically it's like trying to compete in a kind of worldwide motor race with a Trabant.
Yeah.
So the budgets they have and then the stuff that they've come out with and the
Yes.
things they've developed there, it's amazing, I think.
I was wondering, so listening to you talk about Black Virgins reminded me both about something that Charlotte pointed out this morning, but also the introduction to your theater and interculturalism, where you say that part of how we got to the prefix inter is by dismissing earlier ones, right? Trans, cross, intra, multi. But now that we've gotten there, it seems the term will not remain put, right?
Yeah.
It means a very different thing in the Irish context. It means a very different thing in the German context. You don't even hear it in the French context. So I wonder if we're also slowly starting to inch towards thinking about the geographic limits of
Yes.
the theoretical
It's a very
vocabulary
good point.
as we make our way through this day. Or, at the very least having to acknowledge the fact that if the word does exist in different national contexts, it means very different things. Like, for example, a work that cannot achieve aesthetic recognition, but instead has to remain mired in social reality, literature, or whatever. In France, you don't hear reference to culture in quite the same way, at least not minority culture. So anyway, it's been interesting to see that process throughout this day.
Yeah, I think it's huge. It's just such a wonderful point. That's what I'm learning, that in the Irish context, when inter has been used and taken by the state, and that was the statement that you quoted. And obviously when I made that statement, I was uncomfortable about it, but now I'm beginning to realize you're not going to be able to change that, That's how the meaning is in the use. So if people are going to use it in that way, then you have to contend with it in that context and not try and bring your understanding of the context all the time, but you can't let go of that, So I just wanted to support what you were saying. It's really important.
First of all, thank you both very, very much. It's very stimulating discussion and papers. But I want to throw something else on the table, which we started talking about earlier. But one of the things that's I find we're repeating, on the one hand, the contexts are totally different, but there is a repetition in the discussion of Islam, and the thing that I am not in any way resolved about or clear about is the fact that the female body keeps on getting thrown in here, and the female body as the victim of Islam. And I kind of, but it really started, there was a whole, and I don't know how this connects, but this morning I was really taken by the Masala of Moore Street. And the reason I was taken by it was I just looked at the representation of women in it. And in terms of the other male, but in terms of the women, a very conventional notion of the female body. And I found more than anything else, it was when it got to the point of the Bollywood dance and our Irish woman suddenly reveals her middle, like this was kind of, she was becoming incorporated with it. I don't know what you thought, Bristol, when you saw that, but it was like, I thought here we've got extremely conventional notions of the female sexualized Western body. And yet when we're talking about a lot of these different things from the discussion this morning when Brian was talking about, honor killings, Black Virgin, everybody in a sense is coming up constantly with this fact that it's the female body on the stage that is becoming the place where this is being discussed. And I don't know what else to say about it. It's just like throwing it on the table as maybe something we come back to.
And I would also say that in the Irish context as well, that it's been very much the erasure of migrant women from the stage and a lack of representation of women, even when we had our citizenship referendum in 2004, which took away the automatic right to citizenship for children born in Ireland. The focus of that campaign was singling out asylum seeker African and specifically Nigerian women as this, specter, the other of the state, and so on. We've seen changes in more recent years. Mariana Rendulic, who's played Broken Promised Land, is in Matt and I's collection. Polish Theatre Ireland is run mostly by women, but it's been much slower for the migrant female voice to emerge, even while they have been so overrepresented as figures within Ireland. Yeah.
And we had just one other thing in the taxi yesterday, in Dublin, the taxi driver says, talking about Nigerian women who give birth,
Yes.
become pregnant so that they can stay in, all of this stuff.
Yes,
so the kind
exactly.
of body is as the repository of reproduction of claiming a space where you're not really.
Yeah.
But with that, how does that play out, say, with abortion and the globalization
One
of
of
the
the
debate
interesting
around?
things that I kept thinking about when you're talking was there's been a recent production of Sefi Atta, a Nigerian playwright, The Sacrifice in Germany, which is, she's a female writer writing about, being a Nigerian Muslim woman,
but the play is very complex because there are various women with various positionalities. And it was translated and produced in Germany, and I thought that was quite an interesting, I mean, it's interesting that it's being produced in Germany and translated, and now being published as a text in English and German. So I think that this kind of, there are very few women writers or women directors that emerge in these fields and have the power to speak in these fora, and I think that's...
Although there's also the women behind the scenes, so for example Shannon Langhoff, you know, like there's quite a lot of discussion in the stuff on Black Virgins about like, oh, this male director and then this male playwright, and it's all been commissioned by a female producer, effectively, or a female artistic director, and then a lot of the dramaturgs are female, the actresses also have input, so I do think that it's worth looking at, including that aspect when we're thinking about this gender thing. So I agree, it is a problem that there aren't more women.
But do you think this gender, when you're talking about gender in such a potent way, to open it up to academia and the representation of gender in academia, and I'm thinking of German academia in particular, you know, it's apart from our field where maybe we do have an extraordinary figure like Erica who has been in the forefront of that. But by and large, you know, that it's not a very happy place, you know, in terms of, you know, representation or negotiation, and the going back to paternity, what you were saying, Prathana, paternity and these paternal kinds of holes, or the maternal masquerading as paternal, or, you know, being subsumed within the paternal, and these are huge, you know, so in a sense there's not much of a disjuncture between academia and, you know, representation in academia and what's going on in the theatre. I mean, Berlin theatre, it's all about the big guys, you know, and big impresarial figures, tyrannical kinds of figures. It doesn't mean there are no women emerging, but it's very hard to say. They're bringing to that profession a very gendered perspective on it. It's, I don't know, I'm not, you know, or whether it's just, yeah, this is my job, I'm going to do it, you know, and I'm going to have a great production, you know, something very professionally oriented, but I don't know, a gender awareness also, whether that really gets factored, I'm not so sure.
I think, unfortunately, we reached a beautifully spirited point, but we are at time, so it seems like a nice point to draw this conversation towards the coffee and biscuits.
And also what's going to be happening next. So connecting to several of the points here. So next we're going to be seeing I suppose you'd call it a semi-documentary piece done by a local company, a Galway-based company, the Gambines, who are, to my knowledge, unfunded, or it's funded on a project-by-project basis. This work, Stories of Yellow Town, is engaging with the transformation of our nearby neighbor, the town of Gort, from a majority Irish population to 50% Brazilian and 50% Irish, post-Celtic Tiger. So we will have coffee and biscuits next door for about 15 minutes, and then we will lead our guests over to the Bank of Ireland Theatre. NUI Galway friends can amble over there at your leisure, and we'll have a talk back after the show with myself and Jason. So thank you for everything. Thank you for two amazing presentations.